Can we ask the candidates to come in and take their seats, please? Can candidates in this door? Yep.
Oh, did I? Oh, sorry, I broke the rule already. Hey,
Already we have a rebel.
I know, I didn't realize. I don't take instructions well. Was Chris not here? No, I didn't. Oh, that's too bad. Betsy, did they explain about the paddles? You're supposed to hit the person with the paddle.
Oh, excellent. This is going to be fun.
Oh, fine.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Advocate Presents Central Nova Debate 2019. Before we begin, we just want to acknowledge that this event is taking place on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. Okay, so to begin, we'd like to acknowledge our presenting partners, Pulse Pictou County, the Pictou County Chamber, and the Pictou campus of the Nova Scotia Community College. We all had an interest in seeing democracy in action, so we combined forces to present this debate. I'm Jardine, editor of The Advocate, and I'll be moderating this debate along with my colleague, Heather Brimicombe. So we'll begin by introducing the candidates. To my immediate left is Muir, People's Party of Canada. And next we have Barry Randle with the Green Party. And then we have Sean, sorry George. Do you guys switch places?
I wouldn't mind being young like him again. Or that tall, yeah.
George Canyon, Conservative Party. And Betsy MacDonald, NDP, and incumbent Liberal MP Sean Fraser. Missing tonight is Chris Fraser with the Communist Party of Canada. He sent along his regrets. He was delighted to have been asked to participate, but he had to decline because his party leader's in Antigonish tonight, so we respect that. And also missing is independent candidate Michael Slowick, who is listed on Elections Canada website, but with no contact information. So welcome everyone, thank you for attending. A couple of housekeeping items. No vaping or smoking in the building. If you want to do that, you have to go to the far side of the parking lot. Please take note of the exits, 1, 2, 3 exits. If the alarm rings, head to the back of the building or either side, and no cell phones. Please put them on vibrate. Okay, so the order in which the candidates are seated on stage tonight was decided by a random draw. The candidates have all been briefed on the rules of engagement, but for the audience's knowledge, here's how the debate will unfold. Each candidate will be given 2 minutes for their opening statement. Then we'll move into 5 rounds of questions, and candidates will have 2 minutes each to address the topic. Each candidate will be given 5 rebuttal opportunities over the course of the evening. And they have 1 minute per rebuttal. At the end, the candidates have 2 minutes to make their closing statements, and if time permits, we have a final question for the candidates. Timekeepers this evening are Joel and Jamie, so they'll be keeping everything on track. One final thing, we would ask the audience to refrain from applause or making comments throughout the debate, so we're able to finish in the allotted time. And we also ask that the audience and the candidates are respectful towards each other. You don't have to agree with what's being said, but please respect the fact that everyone has their own opinion. So let's begin. Sorry, yeah. The candidates all have these lovely paddles, and these are, when they hold a paddle up, that means they want to rebut what someone has said. And between the timekeepers and Heather and myself, we're going to make sure everybody has their paddle seen, and we'll try to get to them in the order in which they're up. So the first question, and we'll begin with Mr. Muir, and then in the second round, we'll begin with Barry and continue down, then George and continue, then Betsy, and then Sean. So everybody has an opportunity, an equal opportunity to answer the question first. Yes.
Okay, just check.
Yes. Oh, yes. We're going to do opening statements first. So we'll begin with Mr. Muir.
You ready to go now? Hi, my name is El Muir. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. We have a pretty good crowd here tonight. Some of you are, as I can see, are a little older, as I am myself. And you might recall what happened in provincial elections when outside the polling stations you'd occasionally be dropped a pint of rum if you were favorably disposed to a particular party. Being this is 2019, we have a little different approach this day and age. What we do is we take your taxes and we tell you what we're going to buy you with. I'm not here to do that. It's not my intention at all. We believe in small government. We believe in focused government. Right now we have a number of serious issues facing us: healthcare, the issue of pensions, the issue of an aging population outside of Halifax, and we have to look very seriously at where we can spend our money at. And if we go pell-mell spending our money everywhere, there's going to be nothing left for what's important. So what you have to decide in this election is what is important to you. We keep on adding new things to this all the time. Now we're looking at a climate crisis, which some people say is urgent, and in this case, we're at the point where we're terrifying our children about it. I've heard George talk about talking to young people about the pulp mill and how upsetting it was. And now we have this new thing that we have to look at, that our new thing that our children have to be terrified of. And as adults, we're supposed to reassure them that we have answers to these questions. So what you're going to hear is some people talk about these things tonight. I'm not sure that you're going to hear a lot of answers. You're going to hear that we have a lot of the problems, but in a very general terms. But in terms of solutions to these things, I don't think we're going to hear too much here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. Barry?
Hi, my name is Barry Randle. I'd like first to get back to something that Jackie said before she started making her opening remarks, and that's that we're sitting here on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. This is a more important issue than you probably fully realize. I was at the climate march at St. FX a couple of weeks ago, and a young man got up in front of the crowd and he said, "Why don't we take a moment to think about what that means?" Because we hear that statement a lot. And think about where it is that we've actually come from and how it is that we actually get to be here, and what that transition means and who we are as a people. I'd like to make a confession right away that I was not born in this country. I am an immigrant from England. I hold dual citizenship. As I mentioned to George last night, this is one of those things you got to get out of the way right away because it tends to come back and bite you in the butt later on. I'm running for the Green Party because right now we are at a crisis point. We are facing one of the hugest transitions that we are ever going to face as a civilization, potentially as a species. We're seeing massive species extinctions going on around the world. We're seeing the climate coming apart. We're seeing fires in the Amazon, fires in the Arctic, methane being released, the Greenland ice sheets just crumbling and falling apart. This is a very, very dire situation, and it's going to require immediate action. And we need to think about this, and we need to think about Indigenous reconciliation with every aspect of what we talk about tonight.
Thank you, Barry. George?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Canyon, the Conservative candidate for Central Nova. The other day I was out door knocking and came up to a door. It was an elderly gentleman. He opened the door. I put my hand out to shake his hand, and he immediately pulled his hand back and said, "Get the beep back on your horse and go back to Alberta." Emotions are running very high this election, and passion is starting to turn into ignorance. I was born and raised outside of Westville, Foxbrook Road. My dad was the chief tech at the Aberdeen Hospital. My mom worked for Dr. Cole for years, chief of surgery. I went to Dr. W.A. Elementary School in Riverton with both my sisters, Cynthia and Melissa. I went from there to West Pictou District High School when it was still meant for seniors. And during that time, I had it figured out. You want to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. I had it figured out that I would be in the Canadian military. And I joined Air Cadets 374 Squadron in Stellarton, Nova Scotia. I was so excited, but got type 1 diabetes at the age of 14, and that took my dreams away. So I worked hard at Canadian Tire when I was in high school, and the Aberdeen Hospital when I was going to university to get myself into pre-med to become a doctor. But after a play called Camelot, where I was King Arthur, I got picked up by a band, and then the rest is history. 29 years. I've run a successful global entertainment company, not always successful, a lot of sacrifice by my wife and my family, which brings me to this point of getting to serve. You know, we came back during Nashville Star and celebrated in my home in Pictou County, and I'll never forget that, and I'll always be grateful. To have the opportunity to step up and serve the people of Central Nova, I could think of no greater honor ever asked of me. And I will be the voice of Central Nova if they so want me to be.
Thank you, George. Betsy?
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces out here tonight. Really appreciate the turnout. So my name is Betsy MacDonald. I'm running for the New Democratic Party. And just a note on the climate crisis, this is not, in fact, a new thing. I was born in 1984, and at that time, the science was already well on its way to showing that we have to do things drastically differently. Unfortunately, we didn't heed the science as a globe. Instead, we extracted more, we polluted more, we ramped up industry, we ramped up consumer culture. And in the process of doing that, we did great damage to the planet as well as the planet's people. As pollution and environmental destruction increased, so did inequality and poverty. So here we are in 2019, and something that's been causing me a lot of worry is my child's future. I'm a single working mother. I was born and raised in Antigonish. It's where I currently work with the provincial NDP caucus and where I've done multiple jobs in community development. And I'm running for my daughter because I want a better future for her. I want to see a Canada where we continue Tommy Douglas's legacy of Medicare, and we bring in universal pharmacare and mental health, putting it under the Canada Health Act, head-to-toe health care for every single person in this country. I would like to see, and my party would like to see, a world in which workers get the respect they deserve and policies are reversed from the trend we've seen over decades where more and more is given to those at the top and the rest of us see our services cut and our quality of life diminish. We don't have to put up with the usual choices. We can vote for something different and something better. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. And Sean?
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Sean Fraser. I grew up in Miragamish, a small community about 20 minutes away, and though I grew up there, I more or less lived in this gym playing basketball 2 nights a week in high school, so it's great to be back home. I got into politics because there are very big problems in the world that are facing our country and our communities that I want to help solve. The problems like the fact we have a healthcare system that's bursting at the seams. Problems like the climate crisis that our world's facing. Problems like income inequality, where the wealthiest members of society continue to become richer while families struggle with the rising cost of living.
I think my background positions me particularly well to help contribute solutions to these very, very big problems. My study at St. FX in science positioned me well to understand some of the technical details that we deal with when we're talking about climate change. My study in law and my work as a lawyer, understanding how some of the biggest companies do business in Canada, helps me understand how to grow the economy in places like Atlantic Canada. And my studies in international law and working for human rights organizations around the globe have opened my eyes to the solutions that exist in other countries that we can learn from so we can implement them at home. Over the past 4 years, I've been contributing my experience to help solve some of these problems. What we've seen is 1 million new jobs added to the Canadian economy. We've seen a serious plan put forward for climate change, and there's going to be more to come. I want to keep working to solve these very big problems. I may have come from a small community. That doesn't mean that I can't do big things. So on October 21st, I ask that you support me, Sean Fraser, to be your Member of Parliament so we can continue to work on the biggest problems facing our country and our communities.
Thank you, Sean. So as indicated, we're going to start with Mr. Muir for the first round and continue down, and then we'll begin with Mr. Randle. So the first question is on healthcare. Central Nova has a lack of family physicians, as do many other ridings all across Canada. What is the federal government's role in solving this problem?
First of all, healthcare is provincial jurisdiction. People should be questioning why we're even discussing this matter here. The job outside of the Canada Health Act, which is supposed to give us even health care across the country, it's simply an issue of financing. And the two main parties are tripping over themselves to say who was the first to put the new 3% into the equation. But it's really not a matter of how much money is going into it. In 2006, healthcare was a $20 billion expenditure for the federal government. In 2019, it's $40 billion. So it's doubled in just 13 years, yet everybody knows here that our healthcare has deteriorated over that time period. And we've had election cycles, numerous election cycles where we've discussed this issue, but we've failed to correct it over this time. Now we have issues like climate change and so on that we're supposed to deal with, and we haven't even corrected the original problems that have existed for decades. So what has happened here is the provinces are mismanaging healthcare. In the case of Nova Scotia, our doctors are the lowest paid in the country. They're the highest taxed. The bureaucracy they have to work on has ballooned over the years. They're 35% larger than any other jurisdiction in the country. So when you see that kind of money put into the top heavy end of it, and there's nothing, and there's very little for frontline workers, there's a disincentive to stay in this country, and that's what I saw when I was in university, in my university days. People became doctors, they would move off to the US because the opportunities were greater, they were paid more. And we have to look at this realistically, that life has gotten more expensive, and it's also gotten more expensive for them. So we have to have this expectation that they will look at this in the same way as people did in years past, doctors then.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. Mr. Randle, would you like the question repeated, or are you okay?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
As Al mentioned, it's a provincial responsibility largely in terms of how the resources are allocated. And I find myself agreeing too that it's not really an issue of throwing more money at the problem. There is money being spent on healthcare. The problem is that it's not necessarily being spent in the right directions. We need to trim down a little bit at the top, as our colleague Chris Fraser was saying last night, and shame he's not here to make that point tonight. But also we need to sort of restructure where the money is going. We need to look at alternatives. We need to look at physician's assistants and nurse practitioners. We need to look at expanding the seats in our medical schools and offering incentives to graduates who are coming out of those to stay here in the rural areas and practice. We also need to incentivize doctors to be able to practice in the more rural areas. I was talking to some people down on the Eastern Shore the other day, and they pointed out that because of the way the Halifax Regional Municipality is set up, Musquodoboit Harbour, Middle Musquodoboit, and Sheet Harbour all fall within the Halifax Regional Municipality. Because of that, they're considered municipal hospitals. Doctors in municipal hospitals don't get a $40,000 bonus from the federal government that is meted out to encourage doctors to stay and practice in rural areas. Sheet Harbour is considered a municipal hospital. This is an easy fix. This is something that right away the federal government can be dealing with and moving on, and encouraging doctors to practice more. We need to look at funding more alternative therapies, Chinese doctors, acupuncturists, that kind of thing. There's a lot of things that we could be doing with the money other than what we're doing with it right now.
Thank you, Mr. Randle. Mr. Canyon, would you like the question repeated?
No, I think I'm okay.
Okay.
I truly believe that healthcare, be it federal, provincial, it's everyone's issue. I grew up in a healthcare family, dad being the chief tech of the lab, mom working for Dr. Cole. But even more importantly for me, I've counted on our healthcare system every day since I was 14. As a type 1 diabetic, thank God for insulin. But with that comes a lot of healthcare and a lot of responsibility. The Conservative platform is maintaining the funding. The current funding will be maintained, and then a minimum of 3% will be added. The money's there, but it's not all about just the money. You see, we need to solve this problem, and for the last 4 years it hasn't been solved at all, and money's been put in. What we need to do is get on the ground. We need to talk to the people on the ground, the healthcare professionals that know exactly what's going on. For example, I was down in Sherbrooke the other day. A doctor came and I talked to him. He said, "You want to know what's wrong with our healthcare system?" I said, "I would love to know." He said, "Let me tell you, administration for me." 3/4 of his day, he's doing administration. He's having to fill out forms 3 times over. He said, "It's absolutely ridiculous how much administration we have to do in our country. We need our doctors to be doing what our doctors do, nurses, VONs, all of that." The Conservative platform is also putting $1.5 billion into MRIs and CAT scans, CT scans, because we need to have the equipment there so there's no backlog. Right now, talking to the doctors, talking to the nurses, talking to the healthcare professionals is going to help us figure out ways to maintain and keep new doctors. A doctor here is making $100,000 less than a doctor in Alberta. We need to work on equity deals. These doctors are coming out of the university and they have no business training. And yet you expect them to open an office and hire a staff. We need to have our business community mentoring our doctors and offer them equity positions so that what they're making here is equivalent to what they could make out west.
Right on time. Thank you, Mr. Canyon. Ms. MacDonald, would you like the question again?
No, I think I'm okay. So it absolutely is appropriate for us to be talking about healthcare here this evening. On some level, whether we're looking at the federal government's responsibility or the provincial government's responsibility, we have to face the situation. Nova Scotia is in a healthcare crisis. That is very clear. It's clear every time I go and knock on doors throughout Central Nova. It is arguably the #1 struggle faced by the people in our communities, and it is certainly my concern as someone who hopes to represent this area, and I think it's all of our concern. We know that the status quo is not working. Maintaining the status quo is not good enough. People are suffering. So, where do we go? Well, as I said, I'm proud to be running for the party that brought in Medicare. We want to carry on that legacy to include pharmacare for all. Too many people are splitting their pills because they can't afford their meds. People are having to choose between taking their prescription drugs and eating, paying the bills at home. We want to expand hearing, dental, and vision care. Mental health, here in Pictou County at the Aberdeen Hospital, there's no psychiatrist and therefore no mental health inpatient unit. I've talked to so many people. I've heard very upsetting stories about people not being able to access mental health care when they're in crisis. Healthcare is an investment. It's an investment because when we put the resources in that are needed now, we actually save money down the road, not to mention we're doing the compassionate thing for people. It hurts our economy when people are sick. We can do better, and the New Democratic Party will do better.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. Mr. Fraser, would you like the question again?
No, I'm fine, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
We live in a province where tens of thousands of our community members don't have access to a family doctor. I have met too many people over the past few years, seniors in particular, who are not filling their prescriptions because they don't have enough money to pay for the drugs they've been prescribed. I've had too many phone calls to my constituency office from someone who's been threatening to take their own life. It's not an acceptable answer to the people who reach out to a politician because they don't know where to turn, that this is a provincial responsibility. We have to engage to find these solutions to the crisis that our healthcare system is facing. Over the past few years, we've seen, in fact this past year, the single largest transfer from the federal government to the provincial government in the history of our province, and we topped it up with additional investments of about $288 million to improve mental health and in-home care for seniors by putting conditions on those investments. When I saw the platform released, I realized that the advocacy efforts I'd been putting in along with my federal Nova Scotia colleagues were heard by the Prime Minister and by the party. Going forward, we plan to make a $6 billion investment to specifically help provincial governments recruit family doctors, to improve mental health services, to improve community-based care for our seniors, and to implement a national and universal pharmacare system so everyone has access to the medicine that they need regardless of their ability to pay. In 2019, in a country as wealthy as Canada, it is unconscionable to me that people are having their healthcare needs unmet. These are the kinds of problems that I know we can solve and will be part of the Canada that I hope to build.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. We have Mr. Muir who would like an opportunity to rebut. Anyone else?
I can't speak about Barrie here because there hasn't been a Green provincial party that can be held responsible here, but the other three candidates, there have been provincial parties and they have been responsible for this. The NDP was in power for a term. The Liberals and Conservatives have traded over the last several decades, for the most part, without that one interruption from the NDP. And they've failed to call out the province on their failures and their misuse of these funds. They've failed to come up with solutions to this problem. What we're saying here as a party, we want the provinces to take over the harmonized sales tax. They get every dollar of it, then it's clear where the funds come from, who's responsible for it, and the provinces can get to work on correcting this problem. Right now we're looking at a situation where in the OECD countries, Canada, we're justifiably proud. We were one of the first countries, sorry, my time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Muir.
And was there anybody else that wanted to rebut, or everybody's good? Yeah. So question number 2. Voter turnout in Central Nova in the 2015 federal election was 74.7%, up significantly from the 2011 federal election. How do you plan to continue engaging and encouraging voters, especially those of a younger voting age? And what do you think of the suggestion of lowering the voting age? And we're going to start with Mr. Randle.
Well, to beat a familiar drum, I'd like to start out by saying that the Greens will see to it that the 2019 election will be the last election fought under the first past the post system. We've heard that before. It was a very concrete promise from Mr. Trudeau that sort of went by the wayside, and here we are again under the same system. The problem with the first past the post system is that it really makes a lot of voters feel that their votes don't count, right? They don't feel, because it becomes this battle of the titans, that if you want to have, all you end up doing is voting against what you don't want rather than voting for what you do want. And especially for young voters, and especially for disenfranchised voters and lower income voters, they just don't see the point. They don't want to become involved. They don't want to be engaged. We want to actively engage them. We want to make sure that they feel that their votes really count for what they feel they believe in and what they want to see represented in the government as it comes along. We propose lowering the voting age to 16. If you're old enough to drive and you're old enough to join the army, you're old enough to make decisions about your future. That is just basic. I think that is an absolute must that should happen no matter who gets elected. I think that would help engage the younger people towards making decisions and towards participating more fully in democracy. Right now, the kids are screaming about the climate crisis. You see it every Friday in the school strikes around the world. You see it from Greta Thunberg. You see it a couple of weeks ago, 7 million people across the planet out on protests. They want to be heard, and it is incumbent on us to listen to them and represent them and allow them to speak and have relevance in the way the government is structured.
Perfect. Mr. Gagnon?
Voter engagement. I was talking to a young man the other day, about 24 years old. He said this will be the first election that he votes in because he has never really felt his voice would be heard from Central Nova in Nova Scotia out in Ottawa. The government was put in place to empower the Canadian individual. The government is there for us, but for some reason, for many, many years, it's been switched around. And that is one of the biggest problems. And a lot of the youth that are coming up are seeing that. They're seeing that their vote doesn't count. Now, one of the ideas to engage the young is with social media, is with the internet. But what's the problem with that in Central Nova? Connectivity. I've driven the 10,000 square kilometers, or at least that's what it felt like. I've been in all over, and my cell phone barely works. Internet doesn't really exist. We have a problem with connectivity. We need to work on issues like that to allow us to engage the young voting populace. And the Conservative government has a plan for connectivity. And one of the biggest things is to have a Minister of Rural Affairs, is to bring the ACOA office back to Atlantic Canada, where it's supposed to be, with a minister from our region. And all those regions get a fair share of money for infrastructure so we can put internet across rural Nova Scotia, across Central Nova. It's important that we engage that young crowd, but we need to do it the way they're used to being engaged, through the internet, through social media. And as far as the voting age goes, I believe it should stay exactly where it's at. It should not be lowered. It should stay exactly where it's at. I'm not saying that the youth don't have a say, Barry, they definitely have a say, we've witnessed it. But they're just not quite there maturity level-wise to make that kind of a decision about the effect it's going to have on their lives and others around them.
Thank you, Mr. Canyon. And Betsy?
If you're old enough to drive a car, you're old enough to vote. That's my opinion, and that's our party's platform. So before we look at voter engagement, I think we have to look at the source of voter apathy. So right now, at the federal level, we do have a de facto two-party system. There are many in this country who would like to see us break out of this two-party system, and there were many who hoped that would change with electoral reform, which unfortunately hasn't been the case, but we haven't stopped fighting in the NDP for this change, and it's a change we're committed to bringing about. The policies of the status quo parties are literally making people sick and tired. And guess what? When people are sick and tired, they don't feel like getting out to vote or getting out to be involved in their communities. So many people are just caught up in the everyday struggle, the hustle of getting by, working 2 or 3 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, raise their families. For many people, thinking about politics is a luxury. It shouldn't be this way. We have seen cuts to our nonprofit sector over the last couple decades. We've seen cuts to our public sector. These are sectors that increase civic engagement, and we need to reinvest in communities and in these spaces where people can have a voice. Strategic voting, sadly, is something that is being promoted in this election. Too many people are being asked to vote for what they don't want. Well, it's our party's position that people deserve better than that. People's voice is worth more than that. We can vote for what we do want in this election, and collectively we do have the power to bring about change. And I will say too, minority governments serve the interests of people more effectively, and it's in minority governments over history that the NDP has been able to push for some pretty remarkable changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. And Mr. Fraser.
Thanks. I think the reason we saw such incredible voter turnout in 2015 is because people were mad. I mean, my experience was everybody wanted to beat Stephen Harper. It was no secret. It's disappointing to me that people are only engaged at that level when they're angry. They need to be filled with a sense of hope based on the notion that if they actually speak to their politicians, those people who represent them can affect the kind of change that they want to see. It blew me away over the past couple of weeks. For the first few months of this campaign, the same issues kept coming up. Affordability, healthcare, the environment, jobs. The last 2 weeks, particularly since the leaders debate we saw a couple of nights ago, the most common thing people are saying at the door is, can you guys stop talking about each other and start telling us what you're going to do for our community? This is not rocket science. You want to engage people? Go talk to them and then implement the ideas that they give you. It's that simple. Over the course of the past few months, there are 58,000 registered voters in Central Nova. My team and I have had conversations with about 35,000. I've attended in the past 3-4 months just under 300 community events, not including daily visits to Tim Hortons around Pictou County or the rest of Central Nova, the visits to seniors residents I do, or the little town hall type gatherings that we host. It's by talking to people you can actually get a sense of what matters to them and get really good ideas on how the policies that are in place now are causing negative consequences for the people who live in this area. They'll give you the solutions. You have to just go implement them. On voting age, I think it's a great idea to reduce the voting age to 16. When I visit schools, they ask the exact same questions in schools that I receive on the doorsteps. Young people are affected by the decisions politicians take every bit as much as everyone else, perhaps more so when you look at the impact of climate change, which they care about so deeply. You look at the cost of an education they're concerned with. You look at the economic insecurity they experience because they don't know what the changing economy is going to have for them 5 years from now. It's about talking to people and implementing the ideas that they want to see impact their lives.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. And Mr. Randle has asked to
We need
rebut.
to hear from Mr. Muir first.
I'm going to borrow again from the medical issue. Except this time, what I'm going to say is a promise a day keeps the voter away. What we've done, and Sean was right, probably the turnout in the last election was a throw Harper out vote. People were fed up with 8, 10 years, whatever it was, of all these promises. They were fed up a little earlier this time for reasons we've all seen on TV and so on. But in general, what it is that they're tired of being told things and something else happens. They're tired of being told that healthcare is a problem and we're going to fix it, and it's not fixed. They're in general, they're tired. So they see no purpose or no use, some of us. Some of us go through the motions. Let's go in there, we'll hold our nose and we'll pick the one, the lesser of the evils. Let's do it that way. We've tried all kinds of different ways. When we talk about younger people voting, people are talking about it. Of course, the people who benefit the most from it prefer it the most. And who they are is the ones that base their campaigns on emotion. We're going to fix this. We're going to end this climate crisis. There's no clear pathway how they're going to do it, just that they're going to do it. That's enough to get my vote. I'll come out and I'll vote because somebody says they're going to do it. There's no carefully laid out plan how we're going to arrive there. Generalities is what they get. And then when the problem's not solved, they come back in the next election and say, it's time for me to hold my nose.
Thank you, Mr. Muir, and my apologies, I missed you. And Mr. Randle, you're next.
I'm sorry, George, but I can't let that slide, the level of maturity comment. If you look at who is leading the climate action movement around the world. These are high school kids. This is their future. This is their planet. They are the future leaders of all of us, right? We have to listen to what their voices have to say. If we're allowing them at 16 to be able to control a motor vehicle or join the army and go off and fight overseas when they're taking orders from people who we don't even represent them, this is fundamentally a wrong thing. And I really think that we need to honor and respect all people, including our youth, a little more than commenting on their levels of maturity.
Thank you, Mr. Randle. And Mr. Canyon, next. Go ahead.
You can join the Army Reserves at 16. You cannot join the military at 16. You cannot be sent overseas at 16. 16 years old, there's a lot going on in the human body. I remember when I was 16. And of course, the movement is with the kids, definitely. It's going to be their world. Just because they're not voting does not mean we don't listen to them. I listened to my kids as they were growing up as teenagers, and a lot of the time they knew a lot more than I did, Barry, a lot more. Absolutely. And it's important that we listen to them. But to have the right to vote, that's what I'm disagreeing with, changing the age to 16. That doesn't mean we don't listen to them and we don't mind what they're saying and we don't take it to heart and we don't make changes in government because of that. We do. We listen to all the members of Central Nova, no matter how old they are.
Thank you, Mr. Canyon. And was there anybody else interested in rebutting? No?
Okay, round 3, and this time we're going to start with Mr. Canyon. And this question concerns the environment. Given the concerns being raised about a growing climate crisis and the increasing mobilization of youth activists advocating for governments to tackle this issue, what would you or your party do to address this concern?
First off, the environment is not a partisan issue at all, in my opinion. It is everybody's issue. All of us here today, all of our kids, and kids' kids, and kids' kids to come. What we need in government is we need common sense. We need someone there to bring both parties together, the business parties and the climate change, and working together to move forward together. If you have two groups throwing stones at each other, they're going to do it all day long, but nothing's going to move forward. We need to have government doing that. The Conservatives have a plan, a 60-page, 55 policy plan that's realistic. And in that plan, there are different things laid out. One of the things is the Green Home Tax Credit, where we're encouraging Canadians, as 12% of our greenhouse gas, 12% comes from buildings. So we're encouraging Canadian families to do upgrades to their home that will not only save them money in heating and air conditioning, but it would also give them $3,800, upwards of $3,800 back in their taxes at the end. The carbon tax that Justin Trudeau put in place is nothing but a punitive tax. And as Mr. Fraser said the other day, yes, it's not paid directly in Nova Scotia, but it is. And I would argue the point when I talked to the dad the other day at the door that said, the cost of gas, the cost of groceries, the cost of home heating, he said, I'm barely keeping my head above water with all these cost increase. They're going up and going up. The carbon tax will be immediately removed. And the other thing we need to do is realize that that carbon tax didn't get us close to the Paris Agreement at all. In fact, we moved the other way. We need to lower taxes so the young families at the end of the day, all they're worried about is putting food on the table. They're not worried about climate change. We need to engage them so they're a part of this green initiative as well. All of us moving together to make a change, a positive change in our climate.
Thank you, Mr. Canyon. Ms. MacDonald?
So the way we act to meet this climate emergency is going to determine our future. According to our party's plan, the way to act is not or should not be based on what is convenient, but based rather on what is needed. And the climate scientists have been pretty clear on what is needed. The question is, how do we get there? The NDP, if in power, first and foremost would end fossil fuel subsidies on day one. This is critical. It's not just about what we have to do, it's about what we have to stop doing. And right now, we're treating the climate emergency as if we have a whole lot more time than we in fact have. I'm really excited to talk about the NDP's plan for green jobs and climate action. So this is a plan that is very worker-centered, and it would create 300,000 at least good family-sustaining jobs in our communities. It has actually been endorsed by the Steelworkers Union as being an example of how the NDP is the party of workers. So jobs in renewable energy, in local food systems, in things like carbon neutral housing and community transportation. We would set more aggressive climate targets and actually meet them. So another big factor, of course, is Indigenous communities having a voice. This must be central to the way forward, because at the end of the day, it's about the planet and it's about people. We can't impose top-down policies. Yes, we have to be bold. Yes, we have to be brave. And yes, we need to bring everyone along and come together to build a vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. Mr. Fraser?
I've been an advocate for greater environmental protections and to step up our ambition to fight against climate change for as long as I can remember. Literally the very first thing that I signed up for in my life was to be vice president of the Environment Club in grade 2 in my elementary school. And before I got into politics, while I was working as a lawyer, I spent some of my spare time serving as a research fellow for the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. For the past year and a half or so, it has literally been part of my job to help develop federal climate policy to help position Canada as a global leader in the fight against climate change. Climate change is real. It's impacting us today. It's not just impacting our environment, but our society, our health, and our security. The good news is we actually know how to solve the problem if we just muster the political will to implement the solutions that are already available. Over the past 4 years, though we were starting behind the 8 ball, we've made incredible progress. We've put a price on pollution to make sure it's not free to pollute anywhere in Canada. We've made the largest investment to protect nature in the history of our country. We've put new subsidies in place to encourage people to take up electric vehicles. And it's starting to work. Our emissions are starting to come down, but we need to do more. I've been working hard to help develop our platform commitments going forward, and we're committing to net zero emissions by 2050. We're going to ensure that there is a just transition for workers and sectors that are going to be impacted by the transformation of the Canadian economy. We're going to be planting 2 billion trees. We're going to be protecting 30% of our nature, both terrestrial and marine, by 2030. And we're going to be launching the largest home energy retrofit program in the history of Canada that's not just going to reduce our emissions, but is going to put Canadians to work, making 1.5 million homes more efficient, and it's going to save people money by reducing their power bills. These are the kind of forward-thinking solutions that are actually going to make a difference and position Canada as the front runner in the fight against climate change. But it doesn't matter where we are on our own. We have to inspire the rest of the world to join us, because this is a problem of global proportion, and I want Canada to do more than just play its part.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. We now have 2 rebuttals, but we'll let the candidates speak before we... before we get into those. So we've got Mr. Muir and Mr. Randle yet to speak. Go ahead.
I'm first?
Yeah.
Since we're giving out credentials here, I've been a naturalist my whole life and continue to be one. We can talk about this 2 ways, the direction we're going to go with this. We could look at the carbon tax, and all you have to do is on your way home, just look at the trucks that drive by you. The assumption of a carbon tax is that if you make it more expensive to drive your vehicle, that you're going to go to a smaller vehicle, or you're going to go to an...
Counting on these changes to take place in order for our own survival. This is not an optional thing. This isn't the kind of thing that's going to win me any votes here, because this is not what people want to hear, but it's very, very real and very true, and the solutions are clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Randle. Ms. MacDonald, followed by Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, my friends here, for entertaining my rebuttals. I just think this is too serious of an issue not to have a thorough discussion. So Elizabeth May, of course, is known for being a champion of the environment, but she's changed her tune as of late about pipelines and about fossil fuel infrastructure. She's talking about investing in infrastructure so that we can consume more Canadian fossil fuels here in the country. It just seems a little incongruous when thinking about what we have to do to move away from fossil fuels. So I was just wondering if my friend, the Green candidate, might be able to speak a bit to Elizabeth May's recent change in tune.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. It's Mr. Fraser, followed by Mr. Muir.
I think one of the things that we have to look at, that one of the advantages of our plan is that it's ambitious and that we can do it. I know Betsy just mentioned the shortcomings based on a position Elizabeth May's taken. The NDP's plan is not perfect either. Their platform also includes discussions about building refineries in Western Canada. The Eco-Fiscal Commission report has said because there's not a plan to deal with big emitters who would leave Canada and pollute elsewhere, that'll hurt the economy and do nothing to reduce emissions. The Eco-Fiscal Commission has pointed out, or rather Andrew Leach, the academic who actually designed Rachel Notley's climate plan in Alberta, has indicated that there's gaps in their plan that will not allow them to achieve the emissions reductions that they claim that they will be able to achieve. But what I think we have in common is that there's at least 3 major mainstream parties who are trying to do the right thing. We probably have a lot more we agree on than we disagree on. I really hope that we can work together to find the solutions that we know exist, because failure in this challenge is not an option.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Muir?
We have to look at the reality of the situation here. Oil is a finite commodity, we all know that. Regardless of how much we use, it's eventually going to be all gone anyway. So the question is how do we make this transition, and how rapidly we make this transition? What we're saying is that carbon tax will not work. I've outlined one of the reasons for it. This transition has to be orderly. And the idea that we can do it in 10 years is quite frankly ludicrous. Looking at the potential power sources we have to replace it, the most viable one in the future is probably nuclear power, but right now the vast majority of us are not ready to accept that. So we have to look at a longer term here than we're being told, and instead of terrifying our children about this, and they have plenty of things to be terrified about, for sure, and we all know that. So instead of terrifying our children about it, we need to get to work on what we can actually accomplish here, not be all consumed that this has to be done tomorrow, because it's not going to be done tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Muir.
And question number 4. For the remainder of the questions, we will go to a format where the rebuttal immediately follows the question, just so the candidates know. Question number 4, Northern Pulp's future will have an impact on the community. What would you do as Central Nova MP to solve the economic, environmental, and social crisis involving Northern Pulp, its proposed effluent pipe into the Northumberland Strait, and Boat Harbour? And Ms. MacDonald?
Thank you very much. So I wanted to talk about transitions. We've just finished, for now, talking about the great transition facing us with the climate crisis. And one thing that is really true about transitions is that they require leadership. If we let a situation happen to us passively, that's when we end up with situations where people are fighting with each other, where people feel afraid and powerless, and where people don't see their common goals and common priorities. So this is why it's so important to take leadership on the climate crisis, but also in the situation that we have here in Central Nova in our area with Northern Pulp. January 31st, 2020 has been coming for a long time. And it is really unfortunate that the situation has reached a point where so many people are worried about the future. We need to be able to name what's going on and name that if the deadline holds, then yes, the mill is going to close. And if that should come to pass, we need to be talking about protecting workers, pensions, support for the transition, access to employment insurance. We can't bury our heads in the sand. We can't be wishy-washy about this. We need to come together as communities, as people with, yes, different stakes in this economy, but shared interests and shared values. We need to come together around investing in our communities in Central Nova to create good, sustainable, family-supporting jobs and to turn this transition ultimately into a positive story. We need to invest in forestry. We know that there are lots of different ways forestry is being done in Nova Scotia. There are ways that we can increase the production of value-added forest products in this province. Yes, we need forestry in Nova Scotia, but we need to come together to get through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. And Mr. Fraser?
Thanks very much. I'll start by addressing Boat Harbour, which I think often gets lost in the mix given the controversy around the proposed replacement effluent treatment facility. The single thing I've been involved with over the past few years that I'm most proud of in our community is securing an investment of $100 million from the federal government to help clean up the contaminated site at Aseg. Pictou First Nation has lived next to this facility for far too long, and it's an opportunity to right a historical wrong that I'm very proud to have played a small part in. On the controversy around the replacement facility, I committed in 2015 to being part of a government that would make decisions on the basis of science, facts, and evidence. The most recent advice I've received from the federal experts who've actually assessed are looking at the proposal was that they don't have enough information to assess whether it's safe, let alone make the conclusion that it's safe. So if the decision were mine today, based on the information that I have, I could not approve the project. I remain interested in the analysis that the scientists who are considering the proposal and the advice that they're going to provide. When it comes to, I don't want to assume that there will be a closure, but I think it's on the minds of everyone in Pictou County. Should the mill close, we have to be there to support the workers. We're proposing a new career insurance benefit as part of our platform to help workers because we recognize that when their employers close, we have to be there for them. This would be over and above the EI programs that exist. We're making major investments in skills development and training to help workers tap into EI should they not only lose their job, but just want to take work off and have a new benefit to help with the cost of getting an education or skill upgrades. And we do have to diversify our forestry sector. We have a highly integrated supply chain in forestry now, which can be great when it's working, but it kind of puts all of our eggs in one basket should we be faced with uncertainty like we're facing now. I'm out of time, but this is something I've spent more time on over the past 4 years than anything else in my life, and I'm not going to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. And Mr. Muir?
It's impossible to make apologies for Northern Pulp of what's been done over the last 52 years to that community, but it's also, just because I can't do that doesn't mean I can't point out a few realities here. Northern Pulp is not solely responsible for the condition of our forest. When MacTerra was open in Musquodoboit, they milled 130 million board feet of lumber a year. There were a large number of mills, and there's a lot of people that are responsible for the current state of our forest. I'm in the forest every day. I have been for 40, 50 years now. I know it intimately. The Leahy report on forestry tells us the current condition of it. Right now, it's going to take at least 30 years to get it back to the state where we can have a medium number of businesses sawing logs and everything. So if you're told that we can change forestry now in this province, you're being led down one of the paths that I prefer to not walk on when I'm in the woods. Right now, we're looking at two issues with Northern Pulp. It's the pipeline in the strait, which personally I'm opposed to. We're looking at what happens to Boat Harbour. I believe that particularly Sean, since we have a provincial government here that's Liberal, it looks an awful lot like they're going to grant an extension here. And without the permission of that community, that should not occur. The Native community should have final say in this. And what I've wanted all along is for the company to sit down with them and try to figure a way out of this.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. And Mr. Randle?
5 years ago, the northern pulp effluent pipe ruptured on the reserve lands of the Pictou Landing First Nation. At that time, the members of the First Nation blockaded the repair to the pipe. At that point, they could have closed the mill down right then. They chose not to. They chose to negotiate a settlement with the government in exchange for a legislated end that is called the Boat Harbor Act. The Boat Harbor Act has a legislated terminal date of when Northern Pulp has to stop using the facility there, and that is January 31st, 2020. They gave Northern Pulp 5 more years to come up with a plan to deal with their problems, to deal with their effluent, to come up with a plan for the transition of their workers, for a transition for the forestry workers, to come up with a new way of doing business. 5 years later, everybody's at each other's throats because of this proposal to stick a pipe containing the effluent out into the middle of Northumberland Strait and pump it into the fishing grounds. Could they have come up with something that would be more controversial or more ridiculous than that, or generate more backlash? They've pitted us against each other, where this is not what the issue is. This is an Indigenous reconciliation issue. We have been contaminating and befouling these people for 52 years, and it has to stop. They gave them 5 more years to come up with a plan, and they've done nothing. The time has run out. Boat Harbor will close on January 31st, 2020, and after that it's up to the mill what to do and what they want to decide, whether they're going to reinvest, whether they're going to change things, whether they're going to put in a closed loop system. That's up to them, but the mill will close on January 31st, 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Randle. And we have Mrs. MacDonald with a rebuttal.
Yes, thank you. So we've heard right now about the process and about commitment to science, facts, and evidence from our Liberal candidate. A fact is that according to provincial legislation that was signed by the Liberal government in 2015, the Boat Harbor Effluent Treatment Facility will close on January 31st, 2020, as Barry said. But we have heard comments from the Liberal candidate talking about a hypothetical scenario in which there is an extension, and the idea of an extension is causing a lot of worry in our communities. What I'm wondering, or rather what I'm proposing, is that we should all be using our power as voices in this democratic system to pressure those in power to do the right thing. And I would like to know if my fellow candidates are prepared to pressure Stephen McNeil to reassure, especially Pictou Landing First Nation, that indeed Boat Harbor will close on January 31st, 2020.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. And Mr. Kenyon.
I've never seen the community so divided. In all my 49 years, I've never seen this. Brother against brother, town against town. The other day I was in Thorburn. We all got to speak for the grade 7s and grade 8s. They were having a mock debate, if you will, voting. And all the kids had great questions, but one little girl looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, "What about the mill? Our children should not be carrying this on their heart." I didn't know if her mom or dad worked at the mill, if they were foresters or fishers, truck drivers. I didn't know. I've met with multiple groups of fishers and foresters. I've met with Chief Paul multiple times, the mill workers, the pensioners, concerned citizens. You know, when sitting with Chief Paul, she said, "George, we've been lied to and lied to and lied to." She said, "I'm terrified we're being lied to again." We need to honor that commitment that was made to Chief Paul and the First Nations. We need to keep that commitment. The Member of Parliament for Central Nova needs to be the voice of all the people. We have lacked leadership in this crisis from the provincial government for a long time. Premier McNeil has not kept the parties at the table. Without communication, everything falls apart. Without communication, we can't come together like our communities did long before we were born, when the coal mines closed, and my Uncle Sandy told me Papa had to go to other coal mines. But the community came together. And if this mill closes, we need our community to come together to support not just the jobs that are lost directly from the mill, but all the indirect jobs, all the families that are affected in the forest, all the families that are affected in trucking, all the way up into Halifax, into the shipping. We need to come together as a community and be there to support each other.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. And was there anybody else interested in rebuttal? Mr. Muir?
Again, the jobs at the mill are incredibly vital. Nobody here can tell you what we can replace them with. We can talk about business incubators that we're hopeful will produce jobs in the future. We can talk about breweries that my company uses. And they employ very few people, actually, but they are an encouraging trend. And we can talk about a number of these things, but the amount of job loss that we're looking at here is a very, very serious consideration for this community. And it's my belief that what has to happen is that the mill has to sit down with the native community and try to come up with some solution. They're talking about wetland engineering, and when I was down at the mill talking to them, what it essentially is that putting what's supposed to go out in the strait into Boat Harbor in a different section of it.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. And Mrs. MacDonald?
So I think that we are all fundamentally on the same page here, that the commitment to Pictou Landing First Nation must be honored. We've been reassured by the Premier of this province that commitment will be honored, but there's still a hanging question. When? Will it be honored according to the currently legislated deadline of January 31st, 2020? So I'm hearing my fellow candidates say we can and must and will honor that commitment, but when?
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. And was there anybody else interested in a rebuttal? Sure. Mr. Randle.
January 31st, 2020. That's what it says. Well, I mean, it's what's written in law. It's the law of the province. And it's going to be harsh. And as with all of the transitions that we're facing as we move into the green economy, this is going to be another big one. The workers will have to find other things to do. We also need to ensure that the transition to the new economy is just for the employers, and also that the pensioners, the people who've put their lives into supporting this industry and building it up from the ground, don't end up losing out on what they're owed from their own money that they've invested into the company for their pensions over time. That has to be absolutely rigorously secured. That is not a slush fund for the executive to take and use for whatever they wish. We have to look for the workers, we have to look out for the Indigenous populations, and we have to look out for the fishermen and the foresters.
Thank you, Mr. Randle. And is everybody good for rebuttals? Perfect.
Okay, this time we'll start with Mr. Fraser. Despite its human rights record, China is an important trade partner with Canada. In light of the fundamental economic ties our fisheries have with China, how would you work to help solve the current difficulties with Canada-China diplomatic relations?
A great question and an important one. We live in an era where our economy increasingly depends on international trade for our prosperity. When we embrace trade opportunities, and we should, I think it's essential that we work to bring the economic benefits not just to the CEOs of major companies who engage in international trade, but to members of ordinary communities. When people hear that GDP is growing up, or there's new trade deals, or the unemployment rate is low, it doesn't make a lick of difference to them if they see their neighbors without a job and they don't get a raise. We've been fortunate because of the trading relationship we built with not just China, but with European countries, with the North American market and other Asian countries, to see enormous opportunities for economic growth. The fisheries in particular have seen record highs for some of their products as a result of these new trade opportunities. There are serious geopolitical problems in our relationship with China today. They currently have 2 innocent Canadians that are being detained, and we need to insist at every opportunity that they are released without reservation. Obviously, there's some difficulties that persist given the relationship between the Canadian government and China on the file involving an executive of Huawei, a Chinese tech company. The RCMP arrested this individual according to the law of Canada. We are a country that must abide by the rule of law in all circumstances. To do otherwise would tear apart the very thing that makes us Canadian. The RCMP executed their duties with diligence and appropriately, and we need to stick to our guns. I have faith that through conversation we can solve these diplomatic problems. I don't think that we need to immediately cut off all ties to China. They will quickly find other sources to fill the demand in their market. By engaging and having difficult conversations, we can preserve a healthy diplomatic relationship and continue to encourage Canadian business growth with one of our largest trading partners.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Muir.
We talked about Boat Harbor here and the Native community and how important the principle is that what has been said to them is honored. And we're looking at the same situation in China here. 2 of our people are being held captive. And this is the first time I've heard this come up in the conversation, and it should have been one of the top things in the conversation we're having. Our party's position is we will not discuss any trade agreements with China while this is going on. Our people need to be let go, and they need to be let go right now. There's no justification for holding them, how they're being treated there, how they're being denied access to a court system where they could potentially be freed, where they would their case would be heard. Sean's talked about the rule of law. We're not seeing anything resembling that in China, and it's unacceptable. And it's unacceptable that we should be looking at them in an accommodating way on trade. If we're willing to give up these jobs locally at Northern Pulp, we should be willing to give up jobs on a principle of equal value here.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. Mr. Randle.
The issue of the diplomatic relations with China go back way beyond we arrested one of yours, you arrested 2 of ours. There are historic wrongs that need to be rectified. The current situation going on with the protests in Hong Kong, for example, the treatment of the Falun Gong, the treatment of the Uyghurs, the treatment of many of the minority groups there. We need to reintroduce some ethics into trade. We need to ask the question, is it okay to make money from other people's suffering, even if those people are a small group on the other side of the world? Is it okay to exploit this situation to enrich our fisheries? Are there other places we could be selling this stuff? Are there other things that we could be doing? We need to ask these questions first. We need to not only deal with our own fair, equitable, and ethical society here in Canada, but we need to export that through all of our international relations to the rest of the world. We need to lead by example. And for us to say, well, you know, you guys are being bad and you should really not do that, but it's okay because the money's really good. Just doesn't seem like a really good way to go about conducting world trade, world relations, and how we really want to see Canada portrayed on the international stage.
Thank you, Mr. Randle. Mr. Canyon.
The number 1 skill set I learned in 29 years of business is communication. Without communication, you can't have negotiation, mediation, you can't have success. What Canada needs is a true leader in foreign affairs, someone that doesn't go out like Justin Trudeau and embarrass our country with his antics around the world, someone that's there to represent Canadians, to make sure Canada's first and foremost on top of the list. With China, our agricultural community got hurt. It got hurt hard. I know ranchers that left the canola sitting in their field for the first time in their entire family's lives. It just sat there because they couldn't send it anywhere. Cattle farmers with their meat and pork as well. $1 billion to to our agricultural got hurt because of the lack of communication and negotiation, having the skills to be tactful, and I agree, Barry, with human rights issues, but we can use our leverage to make a change in the world, to ensure that China is changing the way they're doing business, the way they're treating people. Strategy needs to be first and foremost in trade. And we've been failed with Justin Trudeau's leadership over the last 4 years, for certain.
Thank you, Mr. Canyon. Ms. MacDonald?
So when we're doing business, it's important to know who we're doing business with. When it comes to the NDP and our stance on international trade and foreign policy, there are a few principles that we feel are important. One is that human rights are upheld and respected. Another is that trade is done fairly. And by fairly, I mean with respect to workers and with respect to the environment. Also with respect to smaller economic players so that we have an even playing field. Unfortunately, that's not the case globally or in our country. So these are the principles with which we would approach relations between Canada and China when it comes to trade. I just wanted to say with respect to the rule of law, so right now, despite rightly calling out the government of Saudi Arabia for its human rights abuses, we are still doing business with Saudi Arabia, and we are selling weapons that are being used to kill women and children in Yemen. We are still doing business with a regime that oppresses women and LGBTQ people. This is a disconnect that must be addressed.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. Anybody have a rebuttal?
And
Come on, guys.
that was our,
You want me to? Okay, fine. See, George gave me the eyebrow here, so I gotta go.
I thought you put your hand up.
No, I hadn't, but
sorry.
I'm happy to.
Well, you don't have to.
You give a politician
No
a microphone, they're gonna take advantage. Look, and I think I've got at least one more of these to burn before we're done. So look, I'll offer a few comments. I think, look, we're at a really interesting crossroads in global economic history. It's easier to do business with people around the world as a result of technological and transportation advances that we never thought possible a generation ago. It raises some tough questions. There are bad actors in the world of global politics. There always have been. I hope there won't always be, but because I'm an optimist, but I may be proven wrong. I think we are right to question whether we should be doing business with dictatorships that use the products we sell them to kill people. I don't think we should. When it comes to, I just do want to address a point that George has made. I get tired of us talking about the silly antics of each other's leader or statements that one another has made. Our actual record on foreign affairs is bringing 50,000 refugees to Canada, which made us a world leader. Advancing trade with the European Union, getting a new trade deal. With Donald Trump as president in the United States with the renegotiation of NAFTA, which I was personally involved with. Securing new trade access with the Asia-Pacific region. I'm getting my time, but my point is, with a thoughtful approach to foreign policy and international trade, we can advance our economic interests and protect and promote human rights at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Anybody else?
great. That was our last question. So for your closing statements, you'll have 2 minutes each. And in your closing statements, please tell us what you think is the biggest problems facing Canadians. And we'll begin with Mr. Muir.
I'm going to look at the biggest problem here as the oldest problem.
Yeah.
Again, speak about health care. Ran out of time the last time, so I have a few moments now to talk about it. So what we have to do, the province has to do, is find solutions to this. Canadians, as I started to say, are justifiably proud because we were one of the first countries that introduced universal health care. But because we look at our neighbor in the south who's lagged behind us on this, we tend to compare ourselves to them. And we have an air of superiority because of it. But what we've failed to do because of that is we've failed to look at other jurisdictions around the world, other OECD countries, What they've done over the years is they've taken our system and they've improved on it. It hasn't stayed in the same stagnant shape as it is. And what we're saying is, right now the Canadian Health Act requires, Section 2, I believe, it requires everybody to have a family doctor. That's your equivalent care. But presently there's over 50,000 of us that don't have a doctor. And we could hold up our hands here, which ones don't have a doctor, and I think we're looking at about 5% of you in this room don't have a family doctor. So what we're saying is, when we look at these other models, people are a little bit afraid to look at some of them. They view it as two-tiered health care, and they think there's going to be one system for the rich, one system for the poor, so they're afraid of it. But if you look at the other systems, it's more as a pathway, rather than one level above the other, us here on the stage, you there on the floor. It's like this group over here and this group over here. There's two pathways down this healthcare thing in Taiwan, for example. The state pays for both ways. You can go to a private clinic, you can go to a public one. And it's all paid for by the government, but it promotes efficiencies. And it's run in more like a business model, so it's run efficiently.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. And Mr. Randle.
I think we've seen tonight part of what the problem is that Canadians are facing, and this is sort of the way that our old school politics has created our society. We just have this system that's shifting back and forth. Oh, well, Mr. Harper did this, but then Mr. Trudeau did this, and then who, Mr. Howe did. It's time to do things a little differently. We need to break out of the mold. We're facing some bigger issues than who the Prime Minister is right now. We are facing an existential crisis that's not just going to affect Canada, but it's going to affect people around the world. And we, as Canadians, need to be able to adapt and shift and move and get ready for the changes that are going to come. There's no avoiding them. They're going to affect our health care, they're going to affect our immigration policies, they're going to affect our international trade, they're going to affect our forestry practices, they're going to affect how we live in our homes and how we feed ourselves. It's going to affect everything, and we need to have some flexibility and some proper representation in government. The people that you elect have to be able to actually represent your wishes in Parliament. They have to be able to take your messages and your concerns to Parliament and express them in a way that you want to see them done. The Green Party is the only party that does not believe in whipped votes. This has been a bit of an issue in the press lately, but it's also a fundamentally different way of looking at how our democracy is structured. We need more representative democracy. We need a government that's more representative of everybody's opinion and everybody's ideals, not just the two sides of the coin.
Thank you, Mr. Randle. And Mr. Canyon.
At the doors, when I've been door knocking, one of the biggest things I hear from mostly everyone is affordability. From families, from individuals, from seniors. Affordability to be able to survive, and not just survive, what happened to the idea of thriving? When my family was very young, we were living at a little farmhouse across the tracks in Hopewell. My wife was working 3 jobs so I could play pubs down at the press room or the Heather, which is no longer there. A moment's silence for that. We didn't have what my granddad would refer to as a pot to pee in. We would sit at the kitchen table and look at each other, my wife in tears, wondering how we were going to make ends meet at the end of the month. If we took our family then and we put it in today's day and age, we would not be able to do it. We'd be on social assistance, we'd be borrowing as much as we could from mom and dad. 2/3 of Canadians have less than $200 at the end of the month, and more than 50% of Canadians right now stopped saving money. They're just fighting to pay the debts. We need to lower our taxes. The Conservative government has a plan. It has a fiscally responsible plan. You know, we can't ask our families to keep a budget, but yet look at our government and give them a blank check like we've done for the last 4 years. We can't do that. Our national debt right now is $768 billion. It is unfair to ask our children's children to have to repay that debt. Today's debt is tomorrow's taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Canyon. And Ms. MacDonald.
Thank you. So I don't know about you all, but I've really enjoyed this feisty debate tonight. Nobody got paddled, so that's great. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, "Now is not the time for small ideas." And I think this is really true, and it really applies to our context in Canada. The climate emergency is the moment that we find ourselves in. The question is, how do we act? How do we come together around this crisis to create a set of solutions that present opportunities for our communities to become more thriving, sustainable, and livable places? The good news about this is that we can actually tackle climate change and tackle income inequality at the same time. In fact, we have to do that. We need policies that address the root cause of both pollution and the growing wealth gap. We can do this by investing in people. We can do this by investing in workers and in good jobs. We can do this by putting the voices of Indigenous communities at the center of the conversation and communities of color and workers at the center of the conversation. We can also do this by bringing in our NDP 1% tax on wealth over $20 million. This would open up billions of dollars in revenue that we can use for fighting climate change as well as for the other social investments I've talked about tonight. And finally, I just want to say I am so proud of Jagmeet Singh. I'm really proud of the leader of my party. He is a champion for exactly the big, bold, and beautiful ideas we need to move forward as a country. And I'm so appreciative of the work he's doing to inspire so many people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. MacDonald. And Mr. Fraser.
I mentioned during my opening remarks some of the really big problems that I want to help solve. Healthcare, the environment, affordability, job creation. The common thread that ties these problems together that I see and connects our inability to solve them comes back to the way that we talk to each other. At home and around the world, I find we increasingly have turned towards this inward-facing politics, this notion that we don't need our neighbors to get along. We treat the people that we disagree with like our enemies instead of our friends and neighbors, and it's getting in the way of the discovery of the solutions that we need to implement to improve our collective well-being. In countries that are not some distant dictatorship, but in the United States and the United Kingdom, you're seeing an ugliness towards politics. It's characterized by demonizing your political opponent. We are seeing this translate into hatred and discrimination towards newcomers. We find someone we disagree with and we treat them as the other. Well, we need each other, folks. This is a difficult time in our world history. If you don't believe me, go on the comment section of a politician's social media page. The discussion is being poisoned by people that I work with in all parties who are pandering to an audience rather than putting competing ideas on the table. We can learn to engage more appropriately, and when we do, we're going to help solve the biggest problems facing the world. A final pitch. If you want somebody who cares deeply about our environment, somebody who wants to solve the healthcare crisis facing our province, somebody who wants to make sure that the economy works for everyone and not just the wealthiest members of society, I ask for your support on October 21st. By engaging with one another, understanding each other's perspectives, we can solve the greatest problems facing our world, our country, and our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. And that is all of our questions for the candidates. And I would like to invite Amanda Hill up to thank everybody.
Hello, I'm Amanda, and with Jeannie, our timekeepers, Joel and Jamie, we represent Pulse Pictou County, who along with the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce are happy to be involved with tonight's event. Thank you to the NSCC for use of their fantastic and accessible venue, and who are always so supportive of our community. I'd like to acknowledge Vision Fire Media, who did the sound tonight, and the online broadcast that was available this evening and will be available after tonight on the Advocate YouTube channel. Thank you to the Advocate newspaper for organizing this event, in particular Blake Ross, and our moderators, Heather Brimicombe and Jackie Jardine. Thank you to the candidates for being here tonight and for putting your names on the ballot. Now, let's give them all a nice big round of applause. And lastly, as you all go, thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you for being a wonderful and respectful audience and for taking an interest in democracy here in Central Nova. Again, a reminder, the advance polls are this weekend and Election Day is October 21st. Thanks and get home safe.
Okay, sign your own panels. Okay, and then pass.